So we'll first look at the respiratory physiology inside of a human. And the first thing we want to look at is the muscles that are used. So the first muscle that we look at is what's called our intercostals, which are found between our rib cages. And then we also look at what's called our diaphragm right here. It's also down here in this picture. And when we breathe in or inspire, what happens is these muscles will contract. So our rib cage will move up and outward when these intercostals contract, and the diaphragm will push downward into the abdominal region. That will set up a negative pressure. So a negative pressure compared to the outside, meaning if the outside pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury, and we push down on the diaphragm and out on our intercostals, it will create somewhat of a vacuum. So let's say the pressure goes to 758 inside. Well, air is going to move from 760 towards 758, which means our lungs will fill up. When we expire or breathe out, we are going to do the exact opposite. So our diaphragm is going to relax, our intercostals are going to relax as well, and the thoracic cage will become smaller. In doing that, your pressure goes up to, let's say, 762 compared to outside at 760, so air is going to be forced out of our lungs. If we look at lung capacity and volumes, the first one that we look at is what's called tidal volume. So that's your normal breath in and your normal breath out. So you're releasing about 500 milliliters of air every time you breathe in and out without thinking about it. If you decide to take a deep breath in, you will reach what's called your inspiratory capacity, which is from the bottom of one of your breaths out all the way to the total amount of air your lungs can hold. So that's your inspiratory capacity. Notice how the line goes from the top all the way to the bottom of your tidal volume. If we subtract the tidal volume from inspiratory capacity, we run into what's called your inspiratory reserve. So it's the amount of air your lungs can take in after you were to take a normal breath in. So if we breathe in, there's still a ton of room, somewhere around 3,000 milliliters of air that we could still take in. That's our inspiratory reserve. If we look on the other side, when we take a normal breath out, there's still some air that we can actually release in what's called our expiratory reserve volume. So this is air that you have to physically push out of your lungs after you've taken a normal breath out. Okay, if we add the expiratory reserve and the inspiratory capacity, that will give us what's called the vital capacity. And that's the total amount of air that we can take into our lungs and completely release out of our lungs. Lastly on here, we have what's called your residual volume, and that is an amount of air that you can never release out of your lungs. It is impossible for us to compress our thoracic cavity enough to release all the air that's in our lungs, and we also don't want that to happen because then our lungs would wind up sticking to themselves on the inside, so we want to keep them separated as well. The way in which we could test the force of air coming out of someone is what's called a spirometer, and sometimes doctors will have you do this if you had surgery recently or you have a respiratory infection. In order to keep your lungs working, increase your muscles working in there, your intercostals and your diaphragm to make them stronger, and also help in breathing in more oxygen so then you can heal faster. When we listen to respiratory sounds, you'll notice that doctors listen to multiple areas. So they'll listen in your upper chest areas, your lower chest areas, and the same thing on your back. And the reason for that is they're looking for two sounds. Or actually, they're looking to hear nothing because that means your airway is kind of clear. Your bronchial sounds is the sound going through your trachea and bronchi. That will sometimes, if it becomes inflamed due to bronchitis, if you have a viral infection or if you have asthma, sometimes you'll hear it where the air passage is closed due to inflammation in that region. Vesicular sounds is the alveoli filling, and that they'll hear due to emphysema. So these people get that when they smoke, and that's a different sound that doctors will be listening for inside of the lungs. When we look at external respiration, this is dealing with the air that we bring into our lungs and how oxygen and carbon dioxide is transferred. Okay, so when we transfer oxygen inside of our blood, it goes from a dark red into a scarlet red, so a very bright red. And what happens here is it's all about pressure. So here is the blood coming into our lungs in our blood vessels. So we have a pressure of 40 with oxygen, and we have a pressure of 45 with carbon dioxide. The outside air has a pressure of 100 with oxygen, and we have a pressure of 40 with carbon dioxide. So as this blood passes by the alveoli, we're always going to want to go from a high to low pressure, or here diffusion with the molecules. So we have 100 on the concentration of oxygen. We have 40 coming in, so 100 is going to work towards 40, so that means oxygen is going to go in. Carbon dioxide is at 45. That's going to work its way towards 40, so that's why carbon dioxide is released out. And as blood leaves, you can see that we have a pressure of 100 with oxygen, and we have a concentration of 40 with carbon dioxide. Now, when we go to higher altitudes, this pressure of oxygen is much lower. And that's the reason why people get lightheaded. They feel sick sometimes if they go at higher altitudes. They can't do as much because your body can't pass as much oxygen along on its red blood cells. Because if this, let's say, was 50, that means this blood leaving would only have a pressure of 50 and not 100. When we look at gas transport in our blood, oxygen is attached to hemoglobin, and we use the element iron to do that. And that's really what gives blood its color of red. When iron attaches with oxygen, it turns like a reddish orange. And that sticks to hemoglobin, and that is attached to our red blood cells. So oxygen is carried by our red blood cells. It gets released into our tissues. And then carbon dioxide, when our tissues release that inside of our body, that goes through a little bit of a transformation. Carbon dioxide gets released by our tissues and muscles. That reacts with oxygen and makes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then gets changed into what's called bicarbonate, and that bicarbonate then goes into our blood plasma, and that's how it gets transferred. So blood plasma carries a majority of bicarbonate, which is what carbon dioxide has been changed into, and then when you get into the lungs, your body will switch it back. Your body will go from bicarbonate, switch that into carbonic acid, and then release that as carbon dioxide outside like we just did on the previous slide. That process is what's called internal respiration because it's happening inside our body with our cells. The difference between internal and external is talking about the air from outside. Even though it's happening inside of our body, it's the air outside that we're transferring oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. Internal respiration, we're looking at oxygen being released from red blood cells into our body cells to be used, carbon dioxide coming out of our body cells into our blood vessels, which would then make their way back to the heart. And that's what this nifty little picture shows, that we have this transformation happening here at our capillaries, and then in our lungs we have the exact opposite. We're releasing carbon dioxide out of our blood and taking oxygen in. Hopefully this helps, and we'll review more in class.